All right. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Delightful to have Aiden Moore back on his Practical Jung series. And he's going to be talking about active imagination. So take it away, Aiden.
Topic today is active imagination, which is basically a forerunner to what we know of today as all the creative arts therapies. And it was developed by Jung, and I use the word developed kind of loosely because it was sort of a necessitation that Jung developed such a thing in his own life, in his own self-analysis, when he was sort of at his wit's end, so to speak, with his own self-development process. That's when he sort of discovered active imagination and used it to his own ends, which he later used with his clients as well. Jung is quoted as having said to never give a lecture on the topic of active imagination without telling the story of the Rainmaker. So I'm going to slow down here at the beginning, start our presentation, and set the stage with this story, which he called the Rainmaker. And it's a true story. And it goes like this. There was once a drought in a village in China. It was becoming a real problem for the village, so they sent for a rainmaker who was known to live in the farthest corner of the country, very far away. And it's always this way because we can never trust the prophets and healers who live in our region. They have to come from somewhere quite far away. So the rainmaker arrived and discovered that the village was in a miserable condition. The cattle were dying, the vegetation was dying, and the people in the community were all affected. As soon as he arrived, the people crowded around him and were quite anxious and curious to see what he would do. The rainmaker, seeing the condition that the city was in, asked to be taken to his own little hut and left alone for a few days. So he went away to his hut and stayed there. The people wondered and wondered what he was up to. One day passed and still he stayed in his hut. 2 days passed and still he remained. And so it went the third day as well. But on the fourth day, the clouds gathered in the sky, and there was a snowstorm at the time of year when no snow was even expected. An unusual amount, and the town became full of wonderful rumors about how this rainmaker could do such a thing. As fate would have it, Jung's own friend, Richard Wilhelm, happened to be in the city at this time, and overcome with curiosity, he went to question the rainmaker. Wilhelm approached him and asked, "They call you the Rainmaker. Will you tell me how you made the snow?" The man said, "I do not make the snow. I am not responsible." Wilhelm asked him, "But what have you done these past 3 days?" The Rainmaker said, "Oh, I can explain that. I come from another country where things are in order. Here they are out of order. They are not as they should be by the ordinance of heaven. Therefore, the whole country is not in Tao, and I also am not in the natural order of things because I am in a disordered country. So I had to wait 3 days until I was back in Tao, and then, naturally, the rain came." So this is the story of the Rainmaker that Jung recommended we tell when we present on this kind of material. And it kind of ushers in a sort of mood, I think, and I hope, in the sense of what we're going to be grappling with today, which is sort of outside of our habitual and normal way of thinking, certainly in the West anyways. And it sets the stage for this sort of alternate way of thinking, this alternate way of being that we're going to talk about in terms of what active imagination can do for us and for the psyche. An early Jungian analyst, Joan Chodorow, said that the greatest use of active imagination is to put us, like the Rainmaker, into harmony with the Tao, so that the right things happen around us instead of the wrong. That's a quote. And that sense of harmony is what we're aiming at with the use of active imagination, that the right things would happen around us instead of the wrong. I did an unusual amount of research, if for those that have been to a few Practical Jung presentations, because the format's changing, And I wanted to really show up for this, and also because this topic really spoke to me. And I really wanted to get at the heart of what the purpose of active imagination is, what it's for, how Jung conceived of it, and so on. And what I found in the research that I did is that active imagination is sort of a subset of the general problem that we find in analytical psychology. And the general problem could be posed as, how does one come to terms in practice with the unconscious? So active imagination is sort of a subset of this problem. How does one come to terms in practice with the unconscious? The implication of that question is that in the totality of our psychology, what Jung called the psyche, we have both contents that we are conscious of or immediately capable of becoming conscious of, and we also have contents that we are unconscious of, or those that we are not immediately capable of becoming conscious of. So active imagination, like many of the tools within the field of analytical psychology, functions to create a union between the conscious contents and the unconscious contents of the personality. And that's essentially what we're aiming at here. The union of a person's conscious attitude with the unconscious contents of that person's psychology. Jung gave a visual aid about this. He didn't give a lot of visual aids, but I'm reading my notes, so I'm hoping that where I'm placing my hands is helpful. I'll do my best with that. But the visual aid that Jung gave is sort of like an x-axis. So a horizontal line where to the right, I hope I have it on mirror mode because hopefully this is your right, but to the right, there's a circle that represents the conscious contents of the personality, and to the left, there's a circle that represents the unconscious contents of the personality. And the goal in all of this stuff, whether we're talking about dreams, whether we're talking about active imagination, and so on, the goal is for these two sort of areas to have an encounter, to have it out, so to speak, and to meet in the middle. What Jung called the midpoint of the personality, right? And I should say, sort of preliminarily, this kind of idea will mean very little to somebody who genuinely has the sense that their life is going along quite well and that they're quite in control. Because somebody who has such a feeling about their own life will not relate much to this tension that I'm describing, the tension that can exist between, conscious part of the personality and the unconscious part of personality. And so this sort of image that I'm giving here will sound a bit abstract and not particularly relatable. But on the other hand, for somebody who's had an experience, who's experienced the sense of wanting to be able to change a habit, wanting to sustain a new kind of routine, wanting relationships to pan out differently, etc., but finds they're not able to create the shift that they want, right? No matter how much they consciously want that shift. For somebody that can relate to this idea of consciously wanting something to change, and yet it not changing, that experience and that person will relate to what I mean. And this sort of tension where you say, the conscious side of the personality wants this, and the unconscious side of the personality is making it quite challenging, right? It's as if the two are operating overly independently or antithetically. So back to the question of how does a person come to terms practically or in practice with the unconscious? There are basically two tools I've noticed in my own research that are often cited in Jung's writings and lectures and so on, that he points to as tools for this exact purpose, right? Coming to terms with the unconscious. One is dream interpretation and the other is active imagination. You see these coming up all the time in his writing. Dream interpretation, he describes as the best tool we have in the building up of the personality. And we did a session with Michael Conforti on this topic, but I will do at some point another lecture on dreams because I want to get to the very practical way of how to use dreams, in a Jungian framework, for the purpose of coming to terms with the unconscious. So we'll do that at some point. And the other tool that often comes up is what we're going to talk about today, and that's active imagination. So what is active imagination? Active imagination is a way of coming to terms with the unconscious by intentionally giving voice to the contents of our unconscious using some kind of creative medium. So it's about using a creative medium to express what's going on in one's own unconscious. People use all kinds of creative mediums for this: writing, painting, sculpting, different kinds of inner dialogue, and even things like music and dancing. Essentially, which medium is used really comes down to the proclivities and the talents of each person. So any of the above mediums and more can be used. And beyond the question of medium, there's also the question of what the contents are, or what we're drawing from to express through our medium. That probably is the crux of active imagination. We have the medium, depending on the talents and the proclivities of the individual. Sort of the crux of the thing is the contents that a person draws from and then expresses through that medium. So generally speaking, these contents that we use in active imagination are dream images is one option, fantasy images is another option, or even, strangely enough, Jung suggests moods. Moods are even an option. And we draw from these sources and create a dialectic with these sources and engage with it through the use of active imagination. So I'm going to give a few examples in the talk today of what active imagination can look like or does look like. But it is important to say right up front, there are dangers. And for those of you who are interested in the workshop and also just interested in doing active imagination in general, there are dangers to this, and Jung is quite clear about this. If someone has, a somewhat unstable personality as it is, I would say this technique is probably not right. And perhaps as a more pressing danger, if someone seemingly has themselves together, but there's some sort of a latent psychosis or highly charged material in the background in their unconscious, active imagination can activate this stuff, and that can be actually quite devastating to the personality. So it's really a practice to be taken with caution and ideally with expert supervision. So in the workshop that I'm running in April, some of it is for that purpose, for some guidance, and so that, I don't want to recommend that people are alone with this practice. I don't think that Jung would recommend that, and I don't recommend that either. Okay, so let's look at some examples of what active imagination can look like. And appropriately enough, I want to start with the originator of active imagination, and that's Carl Jung himself, and the material that he encountered in his own psyche through his own active imagination. In his autobiography, he describes the period of his life as the encounter with his unconscious, and that this period generated the material that became what we know today as the Red Book. For Jung, we have to remember there was no concept of active imagination. So there was no field of analytical psychology, reference point, technique, this kind of thing. That was all stuff that he kind of pioneered. And in the early 20th century, in fact, he had been an adherent of psychoanalysis, which was the therapy that was pioneered by Freud. And but the two of them had a falling out, to put it mildly. You could maybe do another session on that. Ultimately, Jung had discovered a difference in his perspective and went on to publish his thoughts, even though they deviated from Freud. And this caused Freud to basically cut off ties with Jung and basically encourage those in the psychoanalytic community to sort of effectively shun Jung. So suddenly he was no longer in the community he had been in the psychoanalytic community, and he could no longer rely on the methods he had been using in his practice and in that community. He was suddenly thrust into new territory and just didn't have a map. That was where Jung found himself early in the 20th century. It was a very disorienting time for Jung, and he describes it as sort of losing his footing. And he was looking for a new orientation in terms of therapy and for a new criterion related to the development of the personality. And there's a lot to say about this period, so I'm going to try to hone in specifically on the theme of active imagination. But I think what I want to sort of really catch here is that he had become a person who was practicing psychoanalysis, right? And he was a very prominent figure in that scene. So when he realized his ideas were different than Freud's, it was like, on the one hand, coming to terms with that just by virtue of itself. On the other hand, when he was sort of shunned and sort of lost his connection with Freud, it was a very important relationship. He didn't have an alternative method. It wasn't like he went from psychoanalysis to analytical psychology. He was the pioneer of analytical psychology, so he didn't know where to turn to. And this was the state of disorientation that he found himself in. This is where he had lost his footing that had formerly been in the psychoanalytic method. And it was in this period that he was self-analyzing his dreams, that he found that the dreams weren't helping him through this feeling of disorientation. There was a sort of constant inner pressure inside of him, and he started to feel even concerned about his own mental well-being. So ultimately, he decided to face this inner pressure head on, as opposed to sort of do away with it or avoid it. And that exact intention is how he essentially discovered active imagination. He allowed himself to move towards this inner pressure and to see what images it evoked. And further, not just to witness these fantasies and images, but to actively participate with them. So the way he broke the ice with this period of disorientation was to reach a point of such unsurety of how to move forward that he had this sort of a real humility experience in which he came to the conclusion that he knew nothing at all and decided simply to do whatever occurred to him. I mean, he had done a lot of going back into his childhood and trying to get a sort of reductive understanding of why he was feeling this disorientation, and he wasn't getting any fruit from that. So kind of came to this place, I don't know what to do, and decided to essentially submit himself to whatever came up from the unconscious. And the first thing that came up right away when he made that intention was a memory from when he was 10 or 11, playing with building blocks. It was a memory it wasn't really on his conscious. It was something he'd sort of forgotten. And when it emerged, it came up with quite a bit of emotion. And so because he had committed to this idea of engaging with the material that came up from the unconscious, he really connected to this playful, creative, and childlike spirit. And he did his own building. He began to build with stones, and while continuing to pay attention to the fantasies that came up while he did that. So he had this memory. It had an affect. It had an emotional weight, and he moved. He did something about it. He entered into that image of building. And I want to say right away that's a distinction that I want to catch as we talk about active imagination, which is the distinction between active and passive fantasy. Because we all kind of know what it is to let our minds wander, so to speak, and to passively experience our fantasy, whether it's dreams or general fantasy, or just generally letting our minds wander. And in these cases, even fantastic material may emerge, or seemingly mundane material may emerge as well. But in either case, we don't do anything about whatever comes up. It's sort of like we play the role of the witness, and we watch the material as it passes by. Active fantasy, on the other hand, is when we really engage with the material. And that's the premise of active imagination, and that's what Jung did here. He followed his nose with this building game memory that came back to his consciousness, and he engaged with it. And this engagement with the material that was emerging at that time led to further and further engagement with his unconscious, and eventually, went on to the creation of what we know as the Red Book. And I'm going to show you some images here at this point. Am I able? Yeah, here we go. Let me find my, apologies for the wait here. I'm just opening up a separate document so that you guys can see these images here. Let me show you some stuff from the Red Book. It's actually quite amazing images that he discovered. Okay, Can you see that, Shrikant? Will you give me a thumbs up? Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So, uh-oh, this is not the right thing. Apologies. That's unfortunate. Maybe it didn't save the way that I intended for it to save. Let me do a different type of screen share. Sorry, guys. It's unfortunate. I can see it. It's funny on my computer. I can see the image that it should open up to, and it's not opening up to that. So that's quite fun.
What you do is that you click on the you click on share screen.
Yeah.
You will see a bunch of windows.
Oh no, it's not. It's not technical from that end. It's
Okay.
it's just for somehow the file that I created for some reason is not giving me what I want it to. So what I'm going to do is just try one more time a different way. Thanks for bearing with me, everybody. Here's a couple of images. So here's a couple of images. When he moved from the building, for him it was building with stones, he got into painting as well. And it was the same intention, right? It was the intention of whatever was arising from the unconscious, and then finding a way of engaging with it. In the first case, it was the building with the stones. Later, it was the painting. You can see two images that he drew here. And later, it even became beyond just painting, actually engaging with these characters, truly engaging with them, and having dialogues with these figures. Here's another image. One of the prominent images that eventually emerged for Jung in this period of time, in his confrontation with the unconscious, was the image of Philemon. Okay, so this is Philemon here, who kind of became a guide for Jung, as sort of unusual as that sounds. But Philemon emerged while he was exploring these fantasies and sort of became a regular figure that he dialogued with in this period of time. There's a word in German, actually, we don't have an equivalent in English, and it's a beautiful word for this topic, which is betrachten, which means making something pregnant by giving it your attention. And it's essentially what we do in the process of active imagination. By giving the inner world sort of a voice and giving it a sort of attention in a responsible way, it sort of breeds a new life. It creates a new potentiality, essentially, yeah, a new life for a person, which betrachten is just a lovely way of expressing this. So as Jung was giving this attention to his inner life, this figure that you see before you is named Philemon emerged. And he gave quite a devoted attention to this image. And he started to dialogue with it. I mean, he literally would imagine the figure of Philemon. Like, you know, it's like a fantasy, but it's the same kind of thing in a dream. We all have dreams, so we can imagine sort of figures that we don't know in real life that appear in our dreams. A lot of us have this experience. The idea is the same kind of thing can happen in fantasy, where somebody we don't know kind of appears, and in a waking state, we make an attempt to have a dialogue. So Jung now had the image of Philemon in front of him, and he would ask a question to Philemon and quiet his mind as best as he could and really try to listen for an answer from this dialoguing with Philemon and the other images in Jung's unconscious. He really came to the understanding that there are things in the human psyche that we do not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life. Jung was way ahead of his time with this. I mean, nowadays, it might be less shocking because we have inner child work, we have internal family systems, we talk about parts, we talk about dialogues with ourselves and these kinds of things. But Jung was really a trendsetter at that time, you know, having come to the insight that the figures that emerge in our dreams and in our fantasies are actually personifications of material in our own psyche. Jung even would call these sub-personalities at times. And remember, it's sort of the conscious unconscious. What Jung discovered is that the unconscious largely speaks through images, and that the images in the unconscious, this material, often comes out in a personified form. So when Jung was kind of giving his attention, the betrachten, into his inner world, Philemon showed up as a personification of something that was going on over here in his unconscious. And it became engageable, right? It had been personified in such a way that Jung could now sort of engage with this material. And ultimately, he's encountering something about himself that he didn't formerly know. That's the process of active imagination. He encountered something about himself that he formerly didn't even know. So for example, Philemon would say things in their dialogue that Jung himself hadn't consciously thought of in his normal waking life. This ability to sort of really get quiet and ask Philemon a question and then really try to listen to an answer. He was getting answers. I should say, I've done some of this work, by the way, and it sometimes really does happen. That if you can make a space like that, if you pose a question to a specific figure, a personified figure, sometimes there's a sort of answer that will come. And just for a very concrete example, one thing that Jung learned from Philemon is that thoughts are not always things that Jung himself was generating. Formerly, Jung had the idea that he was formulating and generating his own thoughts. But through Philemon, this personification of his unconscious, and through dialogue, he learned from Philemon that another way to look at thoughts is rather that they're like animals in the forest, or people in a room, or birds in the air, or the sort of examples that Philemon gave. And in other words, if you saw people in a room, you wouldn't think that you had made these people or that you were responsible for them. They have an independent, autonomous existence. And so it is with contents of the unconscious, sometimes even including thoughts. And Jung was literally changed by this encounter, this figure Philemon, and went on to cite Philemon as the person through, or I shouldn't say the person, but he learned through Philemon about psychic objectivity, or the reality of the psyche, which is to say what we're kind of touching on here, the objective aspect of the psyche, rather than the subjective. So just to quickly catch this, here's the piece I want to catch from the Philemon example. Jung turned his attention inward. When he turned his attention inward, something emerged. In this case, we're using Philemon as the example. When it emerged, Jung engaged with that material. And that's really the basic undercurrent of what became Jung's Red Book and what we're talking about here with active imagination. If we turn our attention inward, or the pressure from within makes itself so pronounced, it almost becomes a necessity to turn our attention inward. If we do it with devotion, something emerges, and we engage with what emerges, and that's the idea. That's really the basic premise. For Jung, when he did this and sort of generated what became the Red Book, he said years later that when he was pursuing his inner images, this sort of like a 6-year period of time in his life, when he was pursuing his inner images, that was the most important time in his life, and that everything essential was decided. Everything later are details that are supplements and clarifications of the material that burst forth from the unconscious at that time and first swamped him. And he went on to say, it was the prima materia of a lifetimes of work. So I'm going to stop quickly here. I hope for a short stop, but before I go into specific examples, let's take maybe a couple of questions here related to this beginning subject.
Sure. So folks, if you have questions, this is the time to ask. Again, keep the questions only on the material here. No comments, just questions. Lawrence, you had raised your hand. So Lawrence followed by Jonathan. Give me just a second here. Yes, Lawrence, go ahead.
Okay, I had to unmute there. Yeah, hi, Aiden. I read a fair amount of Jung many years ago as an undergraduate in a literature and psychology class, and the part we did some Freud, Jung, Erickson, and so on, and we learned some of the basics, then applied it to interpreting literature. So we talked about the collective unconscious and the archetypes and all the various shadow and anima animus and so on. But two things I had never heard of or come across the Red Book, and so I'm curious about how to maybe find that. And the
Mhm.
second thing is, I do have, but I never got around to reading his autobiography, the Dreams, Memories, Reflections, I think
Mhm.
it's called. And I wonder if you recommend for me and others to read that book, the autobiography, and also to find this Red Book and to delve into it.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Lawrence. The quick answer is yes and yes. I would recommend both, and I would recommend most of Young. Yeah, it's a wonderful collection of material, and the more you read it, the more it. In my case, the more I've read it, the more it's really spoken to me. So I recommend reading as much of him as you can.
And the Red Book is something we could find if we go searching for it, because again, I have.
Very easily, very easily. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Jonathan, Franklin, Judith, and Matt.
I'm going to
Jonathan,
take two for right now. So in
for
terms
right
of
now?
opening it up like this, it's just to get some
Sure.
clarification about the
Okay.
material that we
All
just
right.
covered, because it's going to be material specific, these moments.
Sounds good. So we'll take Jonathan and Franklin, Judith, and Matt would be on the next round.
Perfect.
Jonathan, go ahead. John, give me just a second. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, and I'll try to keep it brief. It's just a clarification. So I'm just this image of Young being sort of swamped with material from these uh, this sort of unconscious exploration is very vivid. You had said that sort of the prima material was the something about a lifetimes of work. I guess
Yeah.
I was curious, is that the product of a lifetimes of work that elicits this explosion of material, or was it the material that became the raw materials for a lifetimes of work ahead? Could you just clarify that a little?
My guess is that it's a little bit of both. And I think some of the rest of the presentation will clarify some of that, in the sense that um, he was really learning as he went. It was a huge part of his disposition and his approach to the work, that he was learning as he went. So essentially what that period did for him, and I'm sort of answering as best I can, is really open up the door to his own unconscious and allow a lot of material to emerge. And it took him essentially the rest of his life to make sense of, I mean, he had, in other words, insights that immediately affected him from that experience. And over the course of his lifetime, it took his whole lifetime to reflect back on that period and make sense of it, and make sense of the things that emerged.
Okay. So Franklin, Judith, and Matt, we'll wait for a question the next round. Go ahead.
I'm so glad that.
Oh, just a second, Franklin. We'll just wait. Okay, let's do one thing. As Franklin has started asking a question, can you go ahead and take one more question, please?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead, Franklin.
Is there evidence that Jung was like doing sitting meditation, or was it actively writing and imagining characters through the writing process? Or was he like sitting and having a sitting meditation dream?
You know, I'm wary to answer that question because I don't know. It was a long period of time that he did this. And I think it was different. And I think he explored different ways of approaching it, all the way from the building blocks from the beginning into the painting and into the dialoguing. And so I couldn't say if there was a specific way that he did it. And to that end, probably it's important to say that for each of us, it may look a little bit different. So I think he was trying to follow the inner pressure that expressed itself through what became the Red Book, but there really is no formulaic version of that, unfortunately, because each person has to sort of come to terms with that.
Wonderful, Aiden. So go ahead with your presentation and we'll take, folks, what we're going to do is there are going to be several places where Aiden is going to stop and take questions. So go ahead, Aiden.
Thanks, Shrika. So there's Jung, right? So there's the example of Jung, and thanks for your questions, clarification questions, and I want to show a couple of other examples, a few other examples of active imagination. So I'm going to give another example. It comes from Jung, but this time it's from a patient of Jung's, and this is an example of a more specifically clinical case. This is after Jung had sort of established himself with his own sort of field of active imagination, of analytical psychology. And this is a clinical case that he used with one of his patients. And we can see how it's used in that context. So here's the fantasy material. He has a patient, and this fantasy is emerging for his patient, and the patient brings it to Jung. So the patient sees his fiance running down the road towards a river. It's winter and the river is frozen. She runs out onto the ice and he kind of quietly follows her. She jumps right down onto the ice and the ice breaks. A dark fissure appears in the lake and he's afraid that she's going to jump right in, which is exactly what happens. She jumps into the fissure, and he watches her sadly. So, you could pose the question, what's wrong with this fantasy? What do you see here that's not quite right? And the issue is, this person is not sufficiently involved in the fantasy, right? Any of us whose fiancés were running into a dangerous situation where they were going to commit suicide, or there was some sort of life-threatening reality, we would rightly do whatever we could to stop them, essentially to save their lives. So probably the last thing we would do in real life, or want to do, is stand idle and kind of watch sadly. So we take from this example that this fantasy is speaking to this patient's lack of a functional bridge to his own unconscious material. Again, if we go back to this sort of image that Jung gives us, there's the midpoint, and then there's the unconscious over here, and there's the conscious over here. They say these things are not really in dialogue. The conscious part of the personality is aware enough that something's going on, the fantasy is emerging, in other words, but the conscious attitude is not able to do anything about it. The conscious mind is kind of frozen about the whole thing, frozen and stuck and just watching sadly. Okay, so, and what we want to do is get that dialogue going, the dialectic going. That's the aim of active imagination. So with this patient, he was struggling with depression and now what we would call somatic symptom disorder, or what we used to call hypochondriasis. And well, that's the differential diagnosis of the patient. What we're looking at here today is how active imagination can foster a certain type of healing, right? This is sort of a non-pathological approach to healing. So the way that happens is by the patient having it out, so to speak, between their conscious attitude and their unconscious contents. In this case, for the patient, it was the fantasy and the depressive moods. So to have it out between the conscious and the unconscious contents, with the result that a new conscious attitude comes into being. So once for this patient, for example, he's got a clear enough sense of his depressive moods and that this underlying imaginal fantasy that represents some of that, and where he's stuck, so to speak, where he's frozen, so to speak. What we're trying to do is see how we can, in ourselves and for Jung, working with patients, get the two parts to really be in dialogue. And one metaphor that's come up for me, it's almost like it's like eating a pizza. It's kind of funny to say, but it's true. When you eat a pizza, you don't just have a pizza in front of you and then suddenly the whole thing you eat the whole thing. You have to kind of cut it up into slices, and that's how you take it in, one slice at a time. And this is what we do with active imagination. I'll show you an example later in the presentation of a longer version, but you'll see as the conscious mind is able to take in more and more from the unconscious, more and more contents, the unconscious, the contents themselves change as the conscious changes as well. It's like taking it in one slice at a time. And, suddenly the conscious understanding of what's going on over here in the unconscious is widened, and the two kind of meet in the middle in a very wonderful way, you know, by broadening the scope of a person's consciousness. So the pizza metaphor is kind of like a casual way of looking at that. We have to take things in one slice at a time. And so here's the slice that this person has, this fantasy. That's the slice. You know, in the case of this patient, he was highly rational and intellectual. So in Jung's typology, he would be a thinking type. And what would be required of this patient was to suspend his highly rational and logical mind when he experienced a fit of depression. Instead of trying to sort of think it away, so to speak, his work was to accept the depression, give it a hearing, and have this dialogue with it. Not just to stand by, right? Frozen by the whole thing, but to give it a hearing and sort of be engaged with it. Now, I love this idea of Jung. I'm going to pause in this particular fantasy because in this case, we're talking about a mood, you know, that presents as depression, but depressive moods, and the image is tied into that fact. So one of the ways to get into active imagination, I mentioned this before, along with dreams and along with fantasies, is moods. If you go into the mood and you try to sort of allow an image to speak what that mood represents, it does something. And Jung talks about this in another place in his collected works, that sort of the idea is learning to make our problematic moods our object, instead of allowing the mood to become in us the dominating subject. Okay, so this is going to take a second to sort through, but the idea is we learn to make our problematic moods our object, instead of allowing the mood to become in us the dominating subject. It's somewhat complicated, so I'm going to clarify some things here. When Jung uses the terms object and subject, he's using those terms in their psychological context. It's very specific. So psychologically, the word subject means me. I'm my own subject. Basically, it's the equivalent of me. When I say me, I'm talking about Aiden's subject. And the other people in the world that are not me, in my world, those are objects. Okay. So for anybody here, like Shrikant, for example, from your world, you're the subject and I'm the object. And for my world, I would be the object. I'm sorry, I would be the subject and you would be the object. And it seems quite simple, right? But it's actually a layered topic, because when you go back to when we're all sort of infants, we don't have such a clear demarcation. We don't have this very clear sense of the me versus the not me. So like, for example, an infant doesn't know where they end and the mother begins. They don't have a fully formed idea of their own subjectness to be able to differentiate it from the object, namely, in this case, the mother, and vice versa. They don't have enough of a differentiation of the objectness, the mother, to separate it from themselves. So it sounds like a rabbit hole. It's very important to this topic because of the fact that we all kind of get this, or at least we think that we do, the sense that I am me and other people are not me. But that's what we're talking about here. So to make the mood into an object is just the opposite of what we would normally naturally do. And we would normally naturally identify with whatever mood comes up. In other words, the mood becomes the subject, the mood becomes the me. It doesn't become a thing distinct from Aiden. And what Jung is saying here is that we can experience a division between me and not me inside of ourselves. A me and not me inside of ourselves is very important, because the division between me and not me, when I talk about me and Shrikant, for example, it's happening externally. And with a reasonable adult level of consciousness, that's kind of obvious. I know I'm me and Shrikant is not me, and vice versa. But what Jung is saying, this is the pivotal kind of life-changing premise, is that there's a me and a not me inside of myself. And this is what happens in Jungian analysis sometimes. This is what we make contact with in terms of the personified contents of our own unconscious, like Philemon, for example, or in this case, the fantasy of this man's fiance. There's a contact with something inside of him that is an object rather than a subject. We're going to touch on this later some more, but I want to introduce it here. Because it's basically just as real that there are things that are other that exist in us, just like there are people that are other that exist out there, or things that are other that exist out there. Actually, I'll give a quick one more analogous example because this really struck me. There was a period of time I was studying Irish Gaelic for a while. It was a very short while because it's very complicated, and I was deterred by that fact. It's a terribly challenging language as an English speaker. But the main thing I remember is how emotions are talked about in Irish Gaelic. So this is to further the subject-object point and this whole context of making a mood an object. In Irish Gaelic, or let's put it with English first. In English, we say, I am sad, I am happy, I'm excited, I'm angry. You see, the feeling and the me are fused. They're not differentiated. In Irish Gaelic, you would say, the expression translates to sadness has come upon me, happiness has come upon me, or excitement or anger have come upon me. So it's like a subtle but very important distinction because it accidentally conveys the whole way of conceptualizing what I'm talking about. We tend to, in our Western culture, be quite developed in ego and individuality, and to feel we're sort of captains of our own ship, so to speak. So we are happy, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm excited, etc. Irish Gaelic comes from a different heritage. It's a little more closely connected to roots and a different way of thinking. I mean, in Ireland, even today, people talk about fairies and spirits and such things. So from this heritage of thought comes the idea that emotions come upon us. See? So Irish Gaelic, the language is actually closer to what we're trying to approximate here when we say to make the mood an object rather than identifying with the mood, and thereby essentially becoming the mouthpiece of that mood and sort of going under its spell, so to speak. So back to the case at hand, what Jung was looking for in this patient was for him to behave in the fantasy as he would in real life. If in the fantasy of the fiance running towards the frozen lake and essentially committing suicide in front of him, the idea is for that patient in his fantasy to not just stand there feeling sad, but act as he would if such a thing were really happening. And Jung would say this is what would prove that he was taking the fantasy seriously. That's what makes it active, not this passive fantasy that we talked about earlier, where you just kind of witness it and see it go by. In the case of this person, they really weren't able to get there. So this person was not able to engage his own unconscious contents and build it into a productive practice of active imagination. And so this is sort of like an example of it not going well. But I do want to say also, in terms of active imagination, when I talk about if this person's image of their fiance committing suicide, it's not about acting out our fantasies. It's not about concretizing and acting them out. For example, if a person has a violent fantasy or problematic romantic fantasy of some kind, it's not about acting it out in real life. It's about engaging with it in a way that takes it seriously. And I want to make that distinction because I don't want to say that what we're doing here is just something comes to mind and we do it. What I'm saying is something comes to mind and we make it an object, whether it's a fantasy image or a dream image or a mood. We make it into an object that we can engage with in a very responsible, contained way. It's a private enterprise. It's really not about acting it out in our relationships. So I don't know how this particular case panned out, but it's an example of an invitation to engage more actively with fantasy material and the real possibility that a person's not able to do it. That's one case. if he was to do it, for example, I went with this in my mind. I was thinking, what would he do if he was a person who was able to really engage with his fantasy material? And in my mind, you know, it might be that person going into their mood and painting the fantasy, painting a series about it, seeing how the image changes over time, you know, this kind of thing. In my practice with active imagination, I do a lot of dialogue. So I might imagine this fiance figure and ask questions. Why are you jumping? Why are you jumping into the water? And see what she says, right? Have that sort of dialogue and really take her seriously, kind of with the hope of understanding her point of view. Alternately, somebody might sculpt the image, somebody might dance the experience and capture it on video, somebody might compose a piece of music. I mean, there are many, many options. But here's the case of an invitation, and we can all kind of imagine what we might do if we were in that example. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Here's the longer example. This is really fun. I had a lot of fun preparing this one. It's from Jung's collected works, where he talks about process of individuation with a patient he had. And it's a case study that involves actually 24 drawings. We're not going to go through all of that, but there's 24 drawings of active imagination involved. We're going to stick with the first 4. And this is going to be an example of a successful active imagination and what that could look like, what it can look like, such things. And in the context of Jungian analysis anyways. Jung expresses in this essay that initial active imagination images, just like initial dreams, so very early in analysis, you might have a fantasy or a dream. These are quite important because they sometimes have an anticipatory value, an intuitive value, and in a sense kind of showcase where the future development of the person can and perhaps will go in the analysis. So once these early images emerge, it's sort of like a matter of understanding them, because the understanding actually becomes a little bit of an X factor, right? Whether the person will reach the stage ahead that the unconscious is laying out for them and for the analyst or not. I mean, sometimes it hinges on this sort of understanding of it. So we can all bear that in mind when we look at this case. The case is of an American patient of Jung's. She's referred to as Miss X. Some of you may have heard of this case. She came into therapy with Jung at age 55, second half of life, and she was quite versed in psychology and extremely intelligent. She was unmarried, never been married, which Jung sort of passingly relates to her positive father complex. Excuse me, which is to say that her affiliation with her father was so much, right, and such a positive relationship to the father figure, that had a negative impact on her relationship to her mother. She came into analysis with the feeling of being stuck and wanting to find a way out of that impasse. Interestingly, Jung describes a majority of his patients that come to him in the second half of their life in a similar condition, feeling stuck with a pervasive sense of senselessness or meaninglessness in their lives. And this case is really right in the flow of that. I'm going to show the images as they come up, by the way, but quickly some introductory remarks. Before going to see Jung in Switzerland, she visited her mother's country. Remember, her relationship with her mother was not very good because she was so identified and connected to the father. And her mother's country was Denmark, even though she'd been raised in America. So the visit to Europe, both Switzerland to visit Jung, where Jung practiced, and Denmark on the way to seeing Jung, that visit kind of related to this growing insight that her nature might have developed quite differently if her relationship with her mother had been better. And so part of her trip to Europe was associated to this idea of reactivating a portion of her childhood that was connected specifically to her mother. And when she was in Denmark, she found herself drawn to painting landscapes, though she previously had no such aesthetic inclinations. And she found that when she did this, there was a feeling of contentment that came with it, as well as a feeling of new life. So all this was happening before her first meeting with Jung. And the day before her first meeting with Jung, she went to paint one of these landscapes. And here's where it turns into active imagination. A fantasy image began to interject itself. And she painted that image instead. So the fantasy was that she saw herself with the lower half of her body in the earth, stuck in a block of rock. She was in an area that was right next to the sea and that was surrounded by boulders. She felt caught and helpless. And in her fantasy, she imagined Jung in the form of a medieval sorcerer. So she shouted for help in her condition, and he came along and touched the rock with a magic wand. That burst the stone open, and she was able to emerge unhurt. And so she painted the initial version of this fantasy. And I'm going to hope that this goes better here with the screen share, and try to open that up. Luckily, the rest of the sharing will be with material that I think was working previously. So I'm hoping that it will not be a problem. So here's the image that is the first painting that she does here. Okay, not as an artist. She's not an artist, but this was the fantasy that interjected when she was going to paint the landscape that she intended to paint. So let's look at this image. I'm getting my screen set up here so I can see the image in my notes. So here's the image. So we look at the image, and here's Jung's thoughts on the image. In the case of Miss X, she was not an artist. And in some ways, this is good because the unconscious has more room to express itself without being cramped by like a strongly developed aesthetic craft. So in this image, we see the fact that the round boulders almost look a bit like hard-boiled eggs. You can see there's like a yolk almost in there. The hard-boiled eggs cut in half. And there's also pointy boulders that look a little bit like pyramids. The picture shows Miss X bound to the earth. This is the part of the fantasy before she's liberated by the sorcerer. And she's attached to the ground in the land of her mother. Remember, this is taking place in Denmark. So psychologically, Jung translates this to Miss X being caught in the unconscious. We might say that she's still partly identified with the mother, but unconsciously so. So she's caught in the unconscious and needs help. That's where she screams in her fantasy for help from Jung, represented by a sorcerer. And remember, early images can be anticipatory, like I was saying. So in this image, in this fantasy, she is able to get out with the help of this fantasy version of Jung. You might say the prognosis is seemingly quite positive in this way. But you see the round boulders that look like eggs, and that's another potentially meaningful fact because eggs as a symbol are often the source of new life. Jung describes them as a germ of new life. So he deduces from this image that the unconscious of this woman is really calling for a new development, what Jung refers to in analytical psychology as individuation, or a form of self-realization in which attachment to the unconscious is loosened. So I'm going to catch that for a second here. He deduced from this image that the woman was calling for this idea of individuation, the same thing he had gone through in the Red Book, right? And he gets to that by these eggs and by the fantasy that she's able to get free from this stuckness that she finds herself in. So when Jung talks about analytical psychology and individuation, he's saying it's a form of self-realization in which attachment to the unconscious is loosened. You can see how in this state she's stuck. She's merged. She's in the frozen state that that the man was watching his fiancée go into the river. However, in this case, her fantasy material points to the fact that there is a positive outcome. So using the subject-object sort of tangent that I used earlier, that's related here. The idea is that if the unconscious can be separated, right? Because if she's fused, the conscious and the unconscious, if the conscious unconscious can be separated and encountered, that's where the transformative thing happens. That's where the transformative things happens. You know, in Jung's book, Alchemical Studies, he describes this in such a powerful way. He says that by understanding the unconscious, we free ourselves from its domination. by understanding the unconscious, we free ourselves from its domination. In a way, she's dominated by it in this image. It's holding her in a certain place. But for this to happen, this freedom to happen, there needs to be a clear differentiation between the subject and the object. And in the case of active imagination, that again, that's the object within, right? The me and the not me that's within. And that happens through this kind of imagery, which emerges from the unconscious, and a conscious orientation that tends to the images, that tends to the fantasy and engages with it from an outside standpoint. So interestingly, the subject-object relationship is very important in active imagination, and understanding that we actually free ourselves from the domination of the unconscious by doing such a thing. So this is where we find ourselves in the first image. After this first image, Jung advised her to also make an image of the liberation from the earth that took place in her fantasy, and that led to the second image. So here's the second image. In this image, the round boulders no longer look like eggs, they're complete circles, and the pointed boulders have gold at the top. This is just, remember, we're going to do 4 images here, but it gives you a sense of the process of active imagination when it goes well, and, you know, sorry for the dog, how a fantasy may begin and sort of evolve over time, because that's exactly what's happening in this series of paintings. It starts with a fantasy, but it really evolves, and you'll see that as these 4 images go along. So now we have the complete circles. We have the pointed boulders now have gold light at the top, and the magician and the magician's wand are no longer a part of the image. There's the flashing lightning bolt in their stead, which is beginning to cut through her unconscious state, if we go into the psychological side, and make a difference here in the whole image. So it's worth noting, when Miss X was making this picture, she had no clear sense of what she was going to paint. She knew that she was going to paint the liberation, but she let the image emerge out of her. And from a Jungian framework, the lightning bolt symbolizes a sudden and powerful change of the inner condition of a person. So in other words, there's a quick illumination of an inner landscape that was formerly dark. That's what's happening here. And the shift is what aids the separation of the boulder, which, it's noteworthy, Miss X expressed that now she identified with that circular boulder, the one that's right in the middle, beginning to separate. In her mind, she identified with that circular boulder that is becoming free from the rock. So the whole image now has taken on an impersonal form, which is what often happens when we're working at the level of the collective unconscious when we go deep with this work. And the collective unconscious is a topic we may do at another Practical Jung, because that's rife for all kinds of discussion. But when we get to these deeper layers of the psyche, things become impersonal, right? So the image of Jung as a sorcerer has disappeared. Now we have an impersonal lightning bolt. And the image of Miss X, who we saw as herself in the stone, has disappeared. And now we have the impersonal image of a round boulder, which she herself identifies with. Now, here we see the changes in the images, but I want to talk briefly about the internal changes that are happening while she's doing this work. And a very interesting fact is that when Miss X was painting this image, she discovered there's 2 internal factors involved in the process. One factor or part of her that she identified as reason, and one part of her or factor that she identified as the eyes, okay? And they had different desires and outcomes for the images that she was painting. So the part of her that she refers to as reason wanted to make the picture as it thought it should be, and the eyes held tightly to their vision and didn't want to adjust the image for the sake of rationalistic expectations or even aesthetic expectations. So there was literally a dialectic going on inside of her as she was painting the image. It's not just the image that's changing. Her inner experience as she interacts with the fantasy is starting to have its own dialectic through this differentiation of the part of her that's the reason and the part of her that's the eyes. So to make that very concrete, the reason side of her, when she was painting this image, wanted to paint a daylight scene in which the sunshine melted away the surrounding rock and freed the sphere that we see freed here. But the quote unquote eyes were attached to this night scene and what she described as, quote unquote, this shattering and dangerous lightning, which she went with the eyes, but she had to sort of, deal with the inner tension of the part of her that she described as the reason that wanted to create this different image. Now, interestingly, as all of this stuff is changing outwardly and inwardly, she associated this lightning bolt with intuition. And I often find the typology references quite interesting in these kinds of material because it's really there. It's really there. And Jung even says he thought this woman to be a sensation type, which would mean that intuition is her inferior function. So the inferior function always compensates, complements, or balances the superior function. It has an underdeveloped and undifferentiated quality, but it also leads to vitality. It also leads to new life. So a powerful image that's connected to intuition would make sense as a meaningful image for someone who is a sensation type in the midst of individuation. That's where the new life is coming from, what we might call the inferior function. Okay, the third image. Speaking of the new life. Okay, the third life, or the third image, has several parallels to alchemy. And in fact, it was this image, for those of you who are very interested in Jung or some other related history, it was this image that led Jung to the decision to do a thorough study of the old alchemists. Jung went on to popularize that field again. It was quite obscure at that time in the 20th century. He repopularized that field, essentially. And it was this image because, as she described it, she herself used alchemical, you could say it sounds partially intentional and even partially unintentional. She used descriptions that were quite alchemical when she described this painting that she had made, this fantasy image. So in a way, we can thank this image for all the work that Jung went on to do later, is really my point, in the realm of alchemy. And if there's time at the end, I'm going to show how alchemy can be conceived of as a form of active imagination, in fact, because that's a very interesting train of thought. But here's the image. There's the silver band. Am I doing this correctly? Yeah. There's the silver band, which Miss X described as keeping the sphere balanced by equal and opposite forces. To the right, above the sphere, is a golden snake, a couple of rings in there. And that's a development from the lightning. And she described the sphere as a planet in the making. And in the middle of the silver band is the number 12, which she described as being in quick vibrating motion. And she described these waves, these black lines, as lines of force and the ones that keep the sphere floating. Here comes the alchemical thing. She describes this, the bands, as the wings of Mercury, and went on. There's a lot of material that I'm leaving out here, but she described a lot of this through alchemical ideas. And I'm going to slow down in terms of this imagery, but something I want to say here, it's actually quite important, is that Jung was really impacted by his patients and the material that emerged in his therapy with his patient. We might think of these, Freud was so much about his own self-analysis, for example, and Jung was too, his own self-analysis, but he was really affected by his patients, and this is an incredible case in point, because it was because of this case with Miss X, he made the commitment to go on and study alchemy. And I wonder, I'm posing this question, how much the way she described this image in an alchemical way changed his whole trajectory. There's a lesser known example of this that I want to share with you, because this you won't find. It's similar in the case of typology, which is why I thought of this here when we talked about intuition. At one point, Jung's idea of typology had settled into three functions: thinking, feeling, and sensation. Intuition wasn't in the mix yet. And at the time, he had a patient, one of his therapy patients, who was talking to him about his typology and posed the question, what about intuition, Jung? Why don't you talk about intuition in your typology? and it struck him. And that led him down the path of studying intuition, what it is, and ultimately adding the concept to his whole framework of typology. It was sparked by that patient. And interestingly, it was no surprise that that patient was an intuitive type, and actually Jung came to understand that patient much better after his foray into intuition. And so here we even see Jung using the concept of intuition with his patient that came from another patient, and the material that comes up here leads to his study of alchemy. I mean, really, he was very affected by this work and the patients that came to him. In this case, here's two examples of female patients whose material had an immense impact on the future of analytical psychology. So I just wanted to call that out. Of note, when Miss X was, we'll just do these first three paintings, by the way, because I don't want to get too stuck on this particular case, but when Miss X was doing this painting, two big dreams of her life came back to her. Two big dreams of her life came back to her. Jung differentiates between big dreams and little dreams, the little ones being kind of personal in nature, easily connected to personal life, and the big dreams, the archetypal ones, touch on the impersonal material and have a big impact on the dreamer. So the first dream, and you'll see how this ties into the image, it's quite fascinating. In the first dream, as it's recounted, she saw a gray globe of the world, a silver band rotated about the equator, according to the frequency of its vibrations, it formed alternate zones of condensations and evaporation, sort of alchemical ideas. In the zones of condensation appeared the numbers 1 to 3, but they had the tendency to increase up to 12, and these numbers signified nodal points or great personalities who played a big part in man's historical development. And that was one dream. And she painted this sphere, and as her fantasy was coming up from the previous material, that dream emerged, and she painted this sphere. And then another dream emerged, actually had happened a year before that dream, which is that she saw a golden snake in the sky, and it demanded the sacrifice from amongst a crowd of people, which was obeyed with an expression of sorrow. Shorter dream. But we can see these two dreams are now taking place in this image, and she told Jung that the image came first without the golden snake, and she felt later that she had to add it, almost that like the intersection of these two big dreams was meant to be harnessed in this, or expressed in this particular art. And she reported to Jung, and here's the most important fact of all of this case. She reported to Jung that the moment of painting this picture was the climax of her life. Those were her words. This specific picture, painting this picture was the climax of her life up until that point. That's how she experienced it. Here she was, having been influenced by the motherland, her mother's land, I should say, in Europe. These dreams are emerging. She's trying to get out of her stuckness, and things are shifting in her inner world. We have reason, we have the eyes, and we have these images, and it's coalescing in this series of what became 24 paintings. And even early on in the process, she has this feeling it's the climax of her life. Really quite a statement. And we also see that there's a brighter atmosphere in this picture, so the increase of light would indicate an increase in conscious realization. And the case goes on. So in this case, we've seen much of what active imagination can be. Just want to catch that before we take a quick break. There's the use of a medium to express the material, in her case, painting. There's the inner wrestling with her inner material. We see this with Miss X, between the voice of reason and the voice of the eye, so to speak. And we see how the images continue to emerge and evolve when she allows herself to go inward, right? When the two are facing each other, she's really focusing with the Brachten, if I'm pronouncing it right, she's really giving attention to this internal stuff, and it's continuing to change, one slice at a time, one picture at a time. It's having an impact on her. Memories surface, feelings emerge, there's a sense of movement in her life, and It's like the two-way street, the betrachten, and it's having an impact. So how much more material do I have? I do want to see, I might as well take a break for questions. That was a long talking.
Aiden, let me give you just a reference. So we are about 1 hour, 20 minutes into the presentation. What's your best guess? How much more presentation do you have? We will definitely take a break right now, but I want to kind of plan the remaining part.
Yeah,
Is
sure.
it about 20 minutes, 30 minutes?
I would say it's probably, let me see what I've got here. Patient's upbringing. Oh, it's okay. There's one more case study. I could be done. I could do one more example. I could do a couple of
Sure.
examples.
So
I'm pretty flexible.
let's give chance for people to ask questions at this point, because I want to make sure that people can engage with what you're saying. So it's
Love
going
it.
to be Judith, Matt, and Madeline next. Judith, go ahead.
Okay, you can skip my question if you want, but I just, because time is so important here, you're saying such important things, but so my question might be too elementary too, but I'm just trying to understand, what is this unconsciousness? Is it something that we build as we grow in our experiences and that we suppress? Does intuition come from the unconscious? Or if that's too off, you can skip.
Well, the second part I'll answer first, which is that the unconscious and intuition are definitely linked in Jung's conception of it, because intuition is perception via means and ways of the unconscious. In other words, it's a function of perception that is happening through the medium of the unconscious, in so many words. That's how we can see around corners with it, right? Like we can see people get premonitions and see all kinds of things that are not obviously there. So intuition, you could say, is a form of perception through the unconscious. And in terms of what the unconscious is, that is a larger question.
I do have a recommendation. Judith, I would recommend watching, we've got about 40 videos on Jung, which systematically deal with all the key concepts of Jung. That would be a good place to start. So that's what I would recommend. Next up is going to be Matt, followed by Madeline. Matt, go ahead.
Hey, so I'm new to Jung too, but I'll refer to those things you just mentioned in the videos. My question for the speaker would be, would you recommend what would be like a good book you recommend that either Jung wrote or it summarizes his writings and teachings? And then one other question would be, so were you saying basically that when the unconscious and the conscious are coupled and they're not decoupled through analysis or whatever, that is what leads essentially to pathology? Thank you.
Okay, pathology, I see what you're saying. In terms of books, it's really hard to say because I have been reading it and I keep finding new things to read and new things that have value. And I would say, Modern Man in Search of a Soul is a pretty good place to start if you want to read Jung's writing. It's a collection of essays that are in his collected works, but in compilation form, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. And otherwise, follow your intuition or there's a lot of forums online. You can get a lot of recommendations. I would follow your own guidance on that, what speaks to you. And in terms of the pathology, I think you're kind of on point there, although I don't know how well enough trained I am to totally answer it, but it's sort of like if the unconscious and the conscious aspect of the personality are too independent, or if they're too antithetical, you could say that would be one way of describing what becomes pathology. Because, in other words, the stuff that we're unconscious of, the further away it gets from consciousness, you could almost say, the more dangerous it becomes. This is a gross generalization, but the stuff that we're unconscious of, the further it gets away from what we consciously know about ourselves, the more dangerous it becomes. So Jung would say, and this is important, one of the traps that we fall into when we talk about the unconscious is that it has a sort of fixed plus or minus sign, or that there's a sort of, the images that emerge kind of have a fixed negative quality or a fixed positive quality. For Jung, it was actually quite relative. So where our conscious attitude lies at any given moment is going to have an influence on how the unconscious part of the personality emerges. And if you're too disconnected from an aspect of yourself, of oneself, it's gonna emerge in a negative form. And one of those ways could be pathology, I would say.
Thank you. And folks, have put in chat the link to all the playlist for Jung. I recommend it quite highly because what we did is that we've approached it from multiple angles. I had a panel of about 4 or 5 rotating Jungian analysts talk about the key concepts of Carl Jung. So it's a great, easy introduction. Carl Jung himself is a difficult read. So I think this is a good way to kind of get in, and this is our channel. So go ahead and subscribe to it. Okay, next up is Madeline. Madeline, go ahead.
There we go. Okay, thank you, Shrikant, and thank you, Aiden. I do have a question for you, or more of asking you to talk about this a little bit more. In example number 2, when you talked about the inner objects instead of the inner subjects, and I think that actually it's something that many people in this meeting may be familiar with, because I think a lot of the people here do the type of sitting meditation where you watch your thoughts go by, you watch your feelings go by, you observe. And in fact, I've read that in Tibetan Buddhism, they don't have separate words for thought and feeling. It's just all called mental objects. And it seems to me that what you're talking about is kind of a 2-step process, that meditation gets us to the point where we can say something or think something like, sadness is going through me now, or I have a big mood this day that's affecting everything. Maybe it will be better tomorrow. The interesting part to me is what happens once you have that objectivity, or that ability to step back and not just get sucked into it all, to treat it all as information and to start dialoguing with it. And I'm wondering if you see that as a 2-step process, and if you see any value to the meditation part. I mean, not just in general, but do you think it's necessary to do in order to engage in active imagination?
Thanks, Madeline. I would say meditation is almost something I would say is a separate topic in a way, because in active imagination, it's a different, I'm wary to use the word technique, but it's a different technique. It's a different practice. Sure, the mental objects, right, or the feeling and the thought, and this way of looking at things that come up when we're in a state of meditation, there may be some corollary there. But the active imagination thing is to, here's what I want to say about this. The Jung found himself as somebody who came from a Western heritage, and primarily like a Christian, Enlightenment influenced Western heritage, and really had to ask the question, if the Christian symbolism doesn't work anymore, what works? What's the myth? The question that was posed for himself, towards himself, early in the Red Book was, what myth am I living by? Because formerly, in terms of his lineage, it would have been the Christian myth, but that wasn't working for him, as it wasn't working for many people. So the thing to say is, he would recommend is to find one's own working system of symbols, or could be expressed as one's own myth. And because of both having that question posed for himself, and because of his heritage in thinking and ideology and religious heritage, he knew that he was in a culture where the idea of the building up of the ego, I mean, now we talk about this in a psychological context, so it sounds kind of academic, but the whole evolution of science and ego and thought and intellect that we inherit, he knew that was a part of his life. And so the analytical psychology approach could be really conveyed as a process of a building up of the ego, as strange as that sounds, because the ego is meant to integrate the unconscious contents in this sort of model. It's to meet in the middle and to absorb, to integrate one slice at a time what's happening in the unconscious. On the other hand, why do I say all of that? Because something like any system of thought that we might adopt or take from the East that has its own lineage and its own heritage, we have to ask, is that, what is that doing for us? And or is it in alignment with the heritage that we receive in our time and place that we're raised? It's really a challenging topic, and I'm probably not speaking to it very well, but a lot of times I find practices of meditation have the intention of the dissolution of the ego, the ultimate enlightenment, or the ultimate sort of being one with the self. This is not what Jung was doing. Jung was trying to take in the contents of the unconscious and have a relationship with the self, but in a process of a building up of the ego. So they're almost possibly two entirely different frameworks that I'm sort of talking around. But does that, hopefully that answers your question some.
Thank you. I don't think I did justice to what Judith and Matt asked, because what they're saying is that, you know, we don't know much about Jung. Where do we get a start? So I think that this is just my personal take on it. I think really what you need to start with is the concept of the self that Jung has, because Jung's concept of self, and I've put a link to that video. If you understand that, that is really his core concept as far as I can see. Our self is much bigger than what we are conscious of. It's humongous. It's humongous. And there are all kinds of things that we have which are stopping us from looking at the self, because you kind of have to go through what he calls, you know, in the filth it will be found. You know, you have to kind of go through things that are stopping you, both your personal things as well as kind of social things, in order to get there. So first is that the idea of self is much larger than your conscious self or the ego. And what he holds is that individuation, your personal development, is making more and more of the self conscious. So you are opening up and accepting more and more part of you. And that video that I have put in, the concept of self, is probably a very good introduction to it, because it's several people talking, several Jungian analysts talking about their own take on the concept of self and the role it plays in Carl Jung's thoughts. So Judith and Matt, that's where I would start. And anybody else, I think that will be a good, it's a very good video. So I'm very, very happy with it. I think George here was a part of it, and several other people were part of it. So thank you. All right, so let's see, we are coming up on 6:30.
Yeah, I could do a couple of things, Shrikant. One quick potential presentation, but I do, before anything else, I do want to say a big thank you, if anybody leaves before the end, for everybody being here. And this was a lot of fun. We're going through some changes here at Practical Jung. So all further events as of now will be last Sunday of the month, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And next month, I'm planning on presenting on the shadow, which is another ripe topic.
So Aiden, just my context, I will have to stop. I will have to kind of, leave around 7:10. I have a sharp deadline at that time. If we can't finish by then, you are welcome to moderate questions on your own. I can keep the meetup open, but I have a meeting at 7:10.
Okay.
So let's take a couple more questions, and then
quick thing, Shrikant, I'm not quite done, but I'm almost done.
Please.
Thanks for letting me know. That's good to know about the end time. And I want to let the people know that are here, again, if you wind up leaving before the end, two things in my world that I do want to share with you. One is I'm going to try to be presenting workshops along with each of the topics that we do here at Practical Jung. So the next workshop will be on an experiential side of active imagination. If anybody in this group is interested in that, that will start April 5th and run for 3 Mondays. I'm putting that link into the chat. So if you want to have a personal experience with some of this material and have the experiential side of it, go ahead and check that out. And I've also started a group that's a good auxiliary group for 52 Living Ideas on Facebook that's specific for Jung learning, community, and support. And I've now put that in the chat as well. So 2 resources in my world that I want to let you know of. And I'm thinking, yeah, maybe a couple of more questions now, Shrikant. I'll give one more quick. There's one case I want to touch on because it's so cool. And it ties a little bit into what Madeline and I were talking about. And I'll say a couple more for now.
Okay, next up is Kevin. Kevin, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to put my question quick. Aiden, is any comparison between the Freud, like subconscious or preconscious with Jung's active imagination? Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Kevin. So you would say this is one of the big points that was the rift between Jung and Freud, because Freud talked about the subconscious and kind of said that that was the whole of the thing, quite in contradistinction to what Shrikant just said, which is that the self is this huge, enormous thing. Freud was of the attitude that all of the unconscious, which the self is a part of in Jungian psychology, all of the unconscious could be reduced to this sort of personal level in terms of what early life had been. And it was basically a sort of a wastebasket of forgotten things and repressed material. And that was Jung's conception of the unconscious, which he called the subconscious, like you said, Kevin. Jung, on the other hand, did not agree with that. He said that what Freud called the subconscious was the personal unconscious. That was the personal aspect of the unconscious that was developed through personal experiences in the lifetime and things like repressed contents and forgotten contents. But he added the scope, he widened the scope of the unconscious to include the collective unconscious, a wider scope that includes impersonal dimensions of the psyche. This is where you get things like archetypes. This is where you get things like the collective unconscious. And Freud did not agree with that. That was part of how they, stopped talking. And so active imagination wouldn't really make sense in the Freudian. Well, I mean, I'm speaking here without thinking much about this. I don't know where active imagination would land with Freud, but I know with Jung, because it's about activating new life, like this Betrachten idea that I was mentioning, the German word, it's giving attention to something, making it pregnant with attention. A very pioneering idea that Jung had was that new life, germinal life, is in the unconscious. Somebody mentioned this in the chat. It's not just that we can reduce all of our life, all of our unconscious to our personal life. There's also a teleological component, which is to say, in the unconscious is the germs of future life. It's pointing somewhere, it's purposive. And active imagination is getting in touch with those germs. It's kind of not a very pleasant word, and I'm regretting I'm not using a better word, but that's the word that Jung used. It's getting into these seeds, these eggs that could give us new life in the future. That's very much what active imagination is about, and not just going into the past and digging up repressed contents.
I just want to add one thing. I mean, when I look at Jung, I don't know Freud very well. Okay, I don't know Freud. But when I look at Freud and Jung from a very large distance, Jung's view of what a human being is and can be is really exalted. It is a very profoundly positive view of what a human being can be. And it is, Freud's view is kind of, it's like, okay, I have to just fix some mistakes in the past. I mean, maybe this is not a fair way of putting it, but I see a very big difference between the focus of Carl Jung. Carl Jung is all about saying, this is what you are. And this is, you're stopping yourself from doing that. So please go ahead and look at yourself.
Yeah.
And so it's a profoundly life-giving view.
Yeah, and it's
Very
it's
different
it's
from Freud. Go ahead.
it is very different. And this is dovetailing on what you're saying, Shrikant. But this Jungian point of view is that in individuation and this goal of becoming ourself or self-realization, of which active imagination is one of the tools, it's really becoming, in fact, who a person really is. It's becoming who they really are, sort of in alignment with what you're saying, Shrikant. So in other words, the unconscious can become a guide. It can become a sort of like a helping force in that matter, and not just sort of an antagonistic repository of repressed wishes and content. So they really are different.
Wonderful. Last question is from Franklin. Franklin, go ahead.
I absolutely love this, Aiden. You did fabulous, and thank you, Shrikant. Would you say that active imagination involves the patience and the discipline to set the stage, whether it is through narrative or through struggling with a work of art, for these vital forces, these inner energies, to find their voice?
Will you say that? Thank you, Franklin. First of all, thank you for your kind words. And will you frame your question one more time for me?
Yes. Is active imagination like setting the stage so that these forces within us that are not us, they're forces that come through us, but we have to set the stage. You can't just sit down and think that you're suddenly going to be channeling, immortal forces. But if you do the homework, if you struggle with the writing, struggle with the painting, put in the time, now you've set the territory for them to enter in. They need a way to get in. You prepare the stage, they can enter in. It doesn't happen in a moment. It happens by serendipity, but you set the stage for that.
I love what you're saying there, and the enthusiasm behind it in terms of what it can do, right? And this setting the stage of this wonderful material. The one place where I would add to what you're saying is it's they're going to be there regardless, right? There's this Jungian idea of asked or not, invited or not, God is there. God will enter. Actually, Jorge, what's the frame that what was the saying that Jung put on his door? George, if you remember, put it in the chat or unmute yourself or whatever.
Inviting or inviting.
There you go. There you go. So in other words, that's the part of where I would add to what you're saying, Franklin, is the contents are there regardless. The question is whether they're, I'm going to use another quote that's maybe more apt for what I'm trying to say. Jung quoted a Greek philosopher, I think, with this and said, fate guides the willing and drags the unwilling. So fate guides the willing and drags the unwilling. It's not that fate is not there. It's not that the contents that we would engage with in active imagination are suddenly invisible because we don't see them. They're going to play out in our life regardless. Like you said, they're autonomous. They're not us. They're going to show up. It becomes a question of, are they going to show up with our participation, or are they going to show up by unwillingly dragging us into situations and conditions and contexts that force us to look at the material that we don't want to look at.
Excellent. So Aiden, let's go ahead and wrap up the rest of the presentation, and then we'll come back to Q&A.
Okay, beautiful. Thanks, Shrikant. So I'll move quickly with this last piece because this is a long talk, and I appreciate all of you being here this amount of time with me. This last case, I just was so struck by this. So I'm glad we're gonna touch on this. So I just found this case. It's in Jung's collected works on the practice of psychotherapy, and I'd not read this before, and it was very exciting. Another younger patient. Okay, she was 25, and she had been previously with 2 other analysts. In both cases, it had not gone well. The analysis was ended in both cases. And when she came to Jung, she was feeling quite hopeless about analysis, and that she had some inferiority around all of these things. Like I said, she was 25. female. She presented with symptoms that sound quite dated when Jung describes them. I'm sure her symptomology would be described quite differently today, but we might say she sounded neurotic, I guess. And certainly in terms of the way that she was presenting and expressing herself to Jung and relating to Jung. So in this case, the patient had a dream while in analysis with Jung that had a very promising prognosis, a very promising initial dream. And like we talked about earlier, sometimes early dreams can be kind of anticipatory. So there was a promising prognosis dream, but then shortly after the dream, the analysis slowed down and moved towards a bit of a stalemate that Jung describes as quite uncomfortable. And finally, after an uncomfortable period of therapy, Jung himself had a dream that gave him an insight how to improve the analysis. And when he took heed of that dream, then the analysis moved forwards in a new way. I just love that little fact there that both the patient and the the therapist can have dreams that affect the therapy. And Jung said after the analysis moved forwards, that's when her real neuroses began. So up until that point, all the presenting material had kind of been preliminary, and two things happened at that point. The patient's symptoms changed, and her dreams became rather unintelligible to Jung, whereas formerly he'd done fairly well at understanding them and translating them. He had a sense that these dreams were powerfully meaningful, but he himself couldn't make sense of them or find their meaning. So while being at a loss, this is where active imagination comes in, while being at this loss, he gave her the task of engaging with her unconscious material using active imagination, suggesting that she draw whatever her hand suggested to her. She had some reticence with this because she had not really drawn before, but she took the task on and began to draw symmetrical flowers and colorful pictures with symbolic patterns. And she did it with such attention and care, Jung said he could only describe it and her approach as having a devout approach to this material. This is a case where, because she wasn't an artist, like I was saying earlier, it may actually have served her because this is where the unconscious kind of can come through sort of unintentionally, right? Without the cramp of sort of a well-worn craft, so to speak. So I'm going to share this. So there's the first image. I'm sorry that it cut off. I'm going to show you three and they all got cut off weirdly. I don't know why. So, you know, it's sort of a mandala figure. You encounter a lot of mandala topics in analytical psychology, but here's one. And what wound up happening is all of these pictures harkened back to her early life, And we'll get to that, but here's the first picture. You can see there's the flowers Jung was speaking of. And here you even see like these sort of demonic faces, the cardinal directions, and these flowers that are emerging in the corners here. And the next image, a different vibe, less demonic in the face, you know, where the faces were formerly, and the corners kind of have emerged, right? So here's 4 points, turns into 8. And you can see it looks as if new flowers are emerging too. And then here's the third image, a lot more energy. And I mean, just look at that. I mean, even without having a lot of relevant, you know, associations or studying mandalas or whatever, you look at that image. I mean, it's such a different feeling than looking at that. This first picture, it sort of feels stuck. You feel the crampedness, this demonic and faces, and the sort of there's not much going on in the center, you know. And here comes sort of like the beginning of something new. And what I also love about this, I'm really reading into this, but you see that the flowers are starting to, they're sort of under the skin, so to speak, and then starting to push out. Now they've pushed out, and you can see even it feels as if new things are sprouting. And now it almost feels like energetically, this energy coming from the center. I mean, just upon immediate feeling of the evolution of the images, I personally really feel something. And what was interesting about these pictures, they wound up hearkening back to the patient's upbringing, which I'll speak of just briefly. The patient was European, and so had all of her schooling in Europe. But before she was school age, she lived in Java, which is near Bali, and she spoke the local language there, which was Malay, and equally importantly, had a nurse caretaker who was Javanese. So she was of European heritage, trained in European heritage, but had this early life experience with a lot of Javanese influence in her life. And it was about this time when Jung had this patient that a book came out about tantric yoga called The Serpent Power. And this book explained much of the imagery of what Jung had not understood in the patient's dreams and symptoms, which were images and symptoms that kind of that pointed to Kundalini yoga, a system that Jung was not educated about formally. And through his study of Kundalini, he began to understand the chakra system. And ultimately, it blows my mind, this fact that the changes in his patient's symptoms were sort of correlated with this chakra system. And her symptoms in that second phase of treatment, when it started moving forward differently, her symptoms started at the base of her spine and kind of moved upwards in a way that seemed to correspond with the chakra system. And so there's another example where a patient sort of, influences Jung and his understanding. And what's so important about this idea of this case, the case was moving forwards, even when Jung was unclear on the material. I could be wrong on this, but I think these paintings were done before Jung had this understanding. I could be wrong on that, so maybe I shouldn't say that. But you can certainly see that there's an evolution here in what's happening in her inner state that's being expressed in these images. And that one of these, and that the analysis did in fact move forwards in a new way and quite powerfully when he gained more understanding about what seems to be a correlated subject matter based on the early life of this patient. And we can see in her case, one of the pivotal changes was in the introduction of active imagination, because when she started that process, it definitely was before he was aware of or had a good understanding of Kundalini yoga. When she started with active imagination, they were both in the dark about it. And you can see how there's a sort of innate healing power. Essentially, this is what I want to say about this. Even without an entirely clear understanding of the therapist, which of course is what we always shoot for, what a person would always shoot for, it speaks to the innate healing power that the psyche has, this urge towards expression and integration, which Jung talks about as individuation. And this kind of evolution can happen in a person's personality, even independent of therapy, because Jung spoke of this. In some cases, when people improve, they get past their neuroses enough to be sort of effective in their lives at that time, they leave analysis, right? And sometimes he'll see them several years later and has the sense a lot more further work has been done since the analysis, beyond what they did in analysis. You could almost ascribe that to this innate striving for wholeness that's inside of this, which I personally relate to. I think it's why it excites me, because I've seen both in my life, both changes that have happened in Jungian analysis and when I'm not currently in Jungian analysis, but trying to follow my own relationship to my own unconsciousness. Growth can happen in both places. So it's quite intriguing to me, this inner movement that can often express itself through mandala images, and that can provoke seemingly a meaningful change, even when it's not quite fully understood how or why that's happening. Although again, the understanding is certainly a meaningful and sometimes necessary stage of the process as well. The last thing I want to say before final questions too is that Jung would normally say that this type of activity is more appropriate for second half of life when we're wanting to engage with the unconscious. And we're quite adapted and established in the world. Normally, although this is a poor case of it because this person's 25, so I maybe will put my foot in my mouth on that one. There may be other conditions that are appropriate, but I'm not sure that first and second half of life would be necessary. So in closing, thanks to everyone again for being here with me. This was really a pleasure. Next month, we'll talk about the shadow and hopefully follow that up with an interactive workshop on that material as well. And if there's any final questions, we'll
All
take them
right,
now.
folks. So it's time for questions. And what I'm going to do is, Aiden, could you go ahead and moderate the questions? So it's going to be Kim and Michael next. If anybody types exclamation mark or raises the hand in Zoom, just call on them.
Okay.
Go ahead. It's going to be Kim. Kim, give me just a second. Let me make sure you can unmute. Go ahead.
Hi, you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Kim.
Thank you so much for this talk. This has been wonderful. You talked earlier, and I think it might come up since, about the benefit of Miss X, I think, not having had previous artistic experience.
Mhm.
And I did check your links, so it's also kind of like, I'm curious about your own work, and also if there's history with Jung, having worked with clients that did have artistic experience and how that differed, or if in your own work, do you encourage people to work in something they're less familiar with, or kind of like what the difference is between if they have experience and not, or training?
You know, that's a great question, and I don't know. You're making me want to learn more about that. To be honest, I know I do know that some of his patients were more artistically trained in terms of crafts, and some less. But I couldn't speak to the difference between the experience or the evolution of that. Although that's a fascinating question. I'll have to might be something for us to stay in touch about, because I would love to actually explore that myself.
Do you have something to say about your own work? Like, do you encourage people to work with something they've trained in or not?
Well, I think the important thing is that a person is doing something, you know, in my point of view. So, you know, I would say the important thing is that that a person is engaging with the material, wrestling with the material, and whatever. I think what intrigues me is that oftentimes people seem to either automatically pick something up, or it's related to something in their childhood. That seems to happen a lot too. You know, a hobby or an interest that was left behind, and entering back into that is because, like with Jung, for example, when he remembered his building game from when he was 10 or 11 or whatever, and started opening himself back up to that, it wasn't just the activity itself. I think this is the important thing I'm trying to get at. It's not just the medium, it's the experience that it evokes, and perhaps even the emotional dimension that it evokes. So you would want to probably look for something that has that evocative element, which, you know, if you have a well-developed craft, you could, and it has that dimension, you would say that's perfect. Or maybe you have a well-developed craft and you find actually you're kind of pulled a different direction in terms of what's charged and alive for you. Or you could be not an artist at all, and you follow your nose on this kind of thing. Is that helpful?
Wonderful.
Thanks, Ken.
Let's go to the next one. It's Michael. Michael, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Hey, Aiden.
Hey, Michael, what's up?
Thanks for this. Really fascinating. Now, in talking about active imagination, you brought up fantasy, and that's something, that whole world has been something that I've been contemplating for a long time, especially in terms of like wounding, you know, trauma, childhood trauma. And what seems to be is that the more childhood trauma, the more propensity for people to drop into fantasy or live in fantasy in their day-to-day life, and have fantasy just, you know, about the world and about themselves and other people just be a bigger and bigger component to the point where it's very destructive, because they become, you know, more and more detached from reality. So I guess my question is, from a Jungian perspective, like, is there anything that he talks about in relation specifically to fantasy and its link to childhood trauma?
That's a great question. That may be another continued conversation too, where we may follow up with you specifically about that. There are Jungian analysts that focus on trauma. Donald Kalshid is one of them, and I'm sure there are others. And but interestingly, Jung from my experience of understanding Jung, was not particularly, oh, people are putting it in the chat too. Yeah, there's a Jungian analyst, and I'll share this with you privately, Michael, as well. There is an analyst that works with the trauma side of things. Jung, interestingly, it's less pronounced, it seems, at least in my reading of his work. The distinction that he does make is passive versus active fantasy, and also the necessity of, adapting, the necessity of adapting and sort of, growing up, so to speak. And not that he would use those terms, but there is a sort of growing up dimension to analytical psychology that's specific to the first half of life. And you'd want to have that experience first, where you feel that you're a person who can will the things into their life that they want. You can have choice about your life. You can relate to people. You're living sort of with your feet on the ground, so to speak. And then that's where the fantasy material becomes more appropriate. So first would be, Jung says first we have we adapt to outer circumstances, and then later in life, more likely adapt to our inner circumstances. And I don't know, that's a little complicated with introversion versus extroversion, but we want to first adapt to finding our place in the world, finding our job, finding our relationships, having our feet on the ground, making money. Then we can say, okay, what else is going on inside of me?
All right, it's going to be Matt, Benjamin, and Flora next. Matt, go ahead.
Do you want me to help this? Shrikant, I'm noticing you're just nailing it with the.
Yeah,
but
that's
I can
fine.
jump in. I can jump in.
Yeah, at 7:10 I'll leave.
Okay.
Matt, go ahead.
Cool. I was going to mention, is there anything, like, I don't know exactly how versed you are in Jung, because I know he's written a lot of works, but is there anything dark and kind of almost like Nietzschean or something almost like that he discovered or untouched about the human spirit that is like contradictory or innately, because I know he was kind of optimistic in his teachings, and I think his idea of trauma is less personalized. Like, I think from what I understand about Freud is the person would come into the office already with preconceived problems stemming from childhood, whereas Jung, I think, had a much broader view of things, and he saw it in terms of life itself is innately traumatizing, and it all stems back from like a collection of experiences from, I would say, like ancient man and our experiences as animals, and that led to this reserve of. But my point is, like, is there anything kind of just like that he didn't really answer, that he kind of talked about, that was just dark and unsettling?
Oh yeah, and I would argue that he was an optimistic person. I think he was quite in touch with real and true evil, and I think he spoke to that on a personal level. We talk about that as the shadow, and on the collective level, we talk about that as evil, real evil, that's even beyond personal. And his concerns about how much damage the human psyche can do in terms of wiping out the human civilization and wars and these kinds of things. He was very in touch with the danger of the human psyche. Jung would say, the psyche is the great danger today. The greatest danger we have today is the psyche, the human psyche, because of the technology that we have now, and the still kind of relatively low level of awareness of how to live, with great responsibility as a collective, as a globe, essentially. So he was quite dark in many places, and some of it's obvious in his writing, and some of it you have to look. But I don't think Jung was an optimist really at all, I wouldn't say.
Next up is going to be Benjamin, followed by Flora. Benjamin. Benjamin, you need to unmute yourself.
Is Benjamin here?
Yes.
You mentioned about dialoguing with emotions. You didn't use the word dialogue. I forgot what it was. And I have problems with very intense anxiety, and I wanted to know how I can dialogue with that find out what it is trying to say to me, because it seems to come up a lot, no matter what happens.
Benjamin, generally, we don't take personal questions like this, but I'm going to leave it to Aiden. Aiden, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we didn't make that clear. And so Shrikant, thank you for making that clear. And also, Benjamin, I'm in great appreciation for your question here. There is another presentation that happened here in Practical Jung in the 52 Living Ideas about the topic of anxiety. A really wonderful Jungian expert, his name's David Rotman. We talked about anxiety, and it's very helpful because what David's idea about anxiety is that it can have, this is hard to say, and especially if the experience of anxiety is very negative, but David's point is that anxiety can have a functional significance in the building up of a person's life, in the sense of what the confronting of the anxiety does for the person. In other words, there's a theoretically productive value that can come out of encountering the anxiety. And in your case, when you say what to do with it, I mean, one, I would watch the anxiety presentation with David Rotman here in 52 Living Ideas. And
I put it in the chat.
Oh, there you go. There it is, Benjamin. Thank you, Shrikant. And just, it's hard to say. That's probably the most comfortable I feel answering kind of at this level, but I hope that helps.
Excellent. Next one is going to be Flora. Flora, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much, Aiden. I know that you have interest in internal family systems and how that might intersect with what Jung put forth well before Dick Schwartz. But I've been using some of those. I've been using the IFS approach with people, and it seems to be pretty sticky with younger people. Kind of, I guess, pushing against this idea of the first half of life.
Mm-hmm.
But it feels really like an active imagination in some way, getting someone to go in and visualize what this thing is, what this emotion is, what this mood is about, or even what the somatic symptom is really about beneath it all. Could you just speak to that?
Well, one thing I think is quite funny is that when we think about perennial truths, for example, you could say people discover them in their own way and from their own windows. And so I don't know that Dick Schwartz is heavily influenced by Jung, but I think in some ways they touched on some of the same material, just inadvertently. It's sort of like it's just the truth, so they happen to come upon it. That being the case, I sort of can relate to your experience in terms of working with younger people. And what was the last piece of your question? Like what to do about it?
Well, I guess I'm just trying to figure out, okay, so if the first half of life is really strengthening your ego, and it seems like active imagination, maybe active imagination is very much a part of developing that ego.
Here's my intuition flaring up. Here's my image that speaks to this. Imagine because from the Jungian framework, the ego and consciousness emerges from the unconscious, right? So it's like the bed, right. It's sort of like the ground of the ground place is the unconscious, and that's through which the ego eventually emerges, and we can say something like, I'm Aiden and this is who I am, and this, these kinds of things. So the image that's coming up for me is like, if you are a person that starts in the ocean and there's quite an undertow, and you claw your way out and you claw your way out, and you struggle at first, you get a little bit out of the water, but then you get sucked back in, and then you get a little bit out of the water and you get sucked back in, and kind of with this heavy work, you kind of make your way out of the pull and the undertow, and finally you make it a little bit on land. You want to really be on land, because I think the depth psychology equivalent of your question is, if some of this kind of work is like that undertow, it's like that pulling a person back into their roots and pulling them back into this place that can swamp them and lose the ground that they've made. It's almost like, if you've made a certain ground, good for you, keep going. Are there problems with it? Okay. Eventually you're gonna have to make some changes. Okay. But if it gets you to the shore, if it gets you to your feet on the ground, then maybe you want to look back and go a little deeper. But otherwise it has this regressive danger of that undertow, pulling somebody back into a place that, is it productive? That's a very important question. Yeah. Okay, Shrikant's out of here. So thank you, Shrikant, for doing all of this. I'll maybe take a couple of more, and I hope I'm doing these in order. I see Lane. Is Lane still here?
Yeah, I'm here. I was very interested in coming today because I'm a teaching artist, and the unit that I started is a unit on playgrounds, on character traits and on playgrounds. And there has been this amazing, I mean, explosion of energy. Many of the children have not been to a playground in over a year. It's a lot of immigrant families who are afraid, and some of them are afraid because they're, you know, they're Muslim or they're, but it's, you know, I have this opportunity. We've just finishing the setting, and what started off, we did these fantasy journeys to the setting. What started off, they've gone so far beyond the model that I made with, you know, the toilet paper rolls and shoots, and so now we're starting the puppets, and I want to be a guide. I mean, in terms of their imagination, I've kept it very structured, but I would also like to be able to help this group of children as a community come together in a healing way with care, with a lot of care. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice in terms of, you know, the boundaries and, you know, pushing. I mean, we're going to be doing these improvs with our puppets in our settings, and this was fascinating for me thinking about this, you know, and about there is so much healing potential in this.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that question, Lane. And I can only imagine that shift for kids, especially who've been off the playground and coming back onto the playground and being, you know, in these different environments that have been taken away for a period. You know, kind of one of the interesting things about Jung, and I learned more about this actually from play therapy, kids kind of know, like kids, they seem to know how to play. It's like they know how to, it happens automatically, the expression and the symbolic expression. So now my understanding mostly comes from analytical psychology specifically. That's sort of where I'm trying to establish myself as an expert. From that framework, you know, Jung talked about the importance of basically the person who the educator is, that's the primary thing. The person who the educator is, that's the thing. In other words, how does Lane hold space for all these challenges and showing up as a full person and being present and providing what the kids, you know, in terms of boundaries or these kinds of things, but really being a whole person for them. That's kind of the Jungian lens on that topic, because Jung would say the primary influence on children is the unconscious of the people around them and the atmosphere that they create. So I almost would say, follow your gut. It sounds like you have a lot of thoughts about this. The only thing I can add is holding space inwardly. How can I be not just for the children, or not just focus on the children, but an inward sense of how can I really show up more fully, more present, these kinds of questions.
Aiden, may I say something?
Yeah, please.
I put in the chat for anyone who's interested, if anyone who's working with children and interested in archetypal material, I would urge you to contact ARAS, Archives for Research in Archetypal Symbolism at the Jung Center. They've been working with elementary and middle school children for the past 4 or 5 years. And if you speak to the curator, Ami, I'm sure she'll work with you.
Oh, cool. There you go. That's a great resource. There you go, Lane. I know that organization, but I don't know about this part of them in terms of their working with children. So there's a great resource. And the resource I think of course, is like the play therapy, like Virginia Axline or whatever. Virginia Axline is like a wonderful, probably the more obvious stuff, but yeah, I think you got this. My general sense sounds like an adventure. Anybody, if you want to just type an exclamation point, I see Madeline.
Yeah, I was just thinking that I'm now seeing a kind of consonance between Jung's work with the unconscious and the active imagination, and the kind of thing that Dr. Randolph Nesse talked about in his presentation on 52 Living Ideas. He basically originated the field of evolutionary psychology. And all of our problems that we are medicating away, rightly or wrongly, have an evolutionary basis, and many of them were useful. Like during the pandemic, I come in the door, I'm putting the rubbing alcohol on the groceries, I'm doing all these annoying things, and I'm thinking, I bet this is how my ancestors survived. I probably have some OCD gene group that's gotten activated by all this. Everyone has, or many people have. And so all of these things like worrying, which is basically forecasting future scenarios, are all incredibly useful. And I like it that that Jung too feels that the importance of using everything in your psyche and everything in your life to journey towards the big S self.
So true. In fact, what you're touching on there, as I hear it, is the importance of the symptom, the value of the symptom. That's a very Jungian idea, that the symptom has value, as opposed to the sort of psychiatric or the biomedical model where you say, here's a symptom, I'm uncomfortable, how do I do away with the symptom? It really is a very Jungian thing, and in alignment with what you're saying. You say, what's the meaning on the other side of this symptom? Or what is it leaning me towards? What it's leaning my attention towards? It becomes this other subset of questions. The energy that's funneling into this neurotic, what I would call neurotic symptom, is there another way for that energy to be used? But essentially there's a value about it, as opposed to something to just be done away with. And like you said, the whole person is used for the big S self. It's a wonderful way of putting it.
Yeah, I've found as I got older and developed actual real problems in life, I got much less neurotic.
That's one way to get rid of neuroses. Have real outer problems. It's wise, and it helps me find the humor in just how, sometimes I like to laugh about these things that are true, because it gives me some sense of lightness about it. Anybody else with the, we're kind of hanging out at this point, and I'm happy to ask more questions if there are questions. I'm sorry, I'm happy to answer more questions if there are questions. Give it a minute. Lastly, I just want to say thanks again. This is an excellent turnout, and I appreciate you guys showing up for this thing that I love so very much. I'm going to put the links in the chat one more time while we're still here, of both the workshop I have coming up and the Facebook group I've started that's really for the purpose of supporting, the education around this material and community around this kind of material. So you'll find me in both of these places. And it's a joy to see everybody. So to be continued, hopefully see you next month. Last Sunday of April, we'll be meeting at the same time and on the shadow. So take care.
Thank you, Aiden.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Aiden.
everybody.
Great job.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.